The purpose of our time together is to talk about obesity. So during this time, we'll look at the physiologic mechanisms of the development of obesity. Let's talk about the cellular basis of obesity, especially as it relates to adipocytes and adipokines. We'll talk a lot about hormones and how they control our food intake and the role of hormones in the development of obesity itself. And then last but not least, have a conversation about the pathophysiologic effects of obesity. So if we think about obesity very simply, and the way we used to look at it is, simply enough, the intake of calories is greater than the expenditure of calories. Well, we've learned a lot about obesity in the last 20 years, and now we recognize that obesity is a metabolic disorder, and that metabolic disorder is characterized by an increase in body fat. We know that obesity has been linked to cardiovascular disease, the development of type 2 diabetes, as well as a number of cancers. When we first started looking at cancers and obesity, we had a somewhat short list. There were about 8, maybe 9 cancers that were associated with obesity. In 2014, the last time they looked at this very, very carefully in the data, there are certainly 14 and perhaps even more than that cancers that are specifically linked to obesity. Now, the other thing that we want to think about is that obesity is not universally bad. Although we tend to associate obesity with increased mortality in elders and in individuals with end-stage kidney disease, advanced end-stage kidney disease, we know that obesity, a high body mass index, is actually linked to decreased mortality as opposed to increased mortality. As we look for a definition of obesity and what we mean by an increase in body fat, we need to look at both adults and children. In an adult, overweight is defined as a BMI greater than 25 milligrams per meter squared. Obesity, as you can see, is greater than 30, and morbid obesity is greater than 40 kilos per meter squared. In a child, please add this to your notes. I apologize for not putting this on the slide initially, but in a child, we're looking for weight that is equal or greater than the 95th percentile for gender and age. This is incredibly important when you're working with children. We know that worldwide, as well as in the United States, we are seeing a dramatic increase in obesity in children. We also know that this metabolic disorder of obesity has predisposing factors, and we're looking specifically both at genotype as well as gene-environment interactions. Now, when we look at the genotype, we're usually not looking at a single gene, so we're usually looking at polygenic as well as other phenotypes. But when we do look at a single gene basis, there are 4 big ones that we take a look at. Leptin and leptin receptors are 2 of the big ones, as well as melanocortin 4 receptor. Now, these are the 3 that we know about the most. And when you think about the obesity gene, you're usually thinking about leptin. But there's another gene that's been identified, and that is the FTO gene variant. And this FTO gene variant is a fat mass and obesity associated protein enzyme on chromosome 16. And although this doesn't have a huge effect, it does have a small effect. In individuals that have 2 copies of this variant, they had on average a body weight 6.5 pounds greater than those who did not have 2 copies of this variant. Now, what's very interesting about this, though, is that they identified that in those individuals that had 2 copies of the FTO gene variant, exercise actually could counteract this gene variant, so that exercise made the individual resistant to the effects of the variant. I thought that was just terribly interesting and had to share it with you. Sorry, I have trouble changing my slide, aren't I? There it goes. So let's take a look then at the cellular basis of obesity, and a lot of that is based on understanding adipokines. We know that when we think about obesity, there's an interaction between neurotransmitters, cytokines, and hormones. We know that adipokinins are secreted by the adipocytes, our fat cells, and this includes both the hormones and the cytokines. Now, these adipokinins play multiple roles, and you can see them listed on the slide, so I won't repeat them. But we know that they are very important in the regulation of energy metabolism. We also know that they're extremely important in not only our food intake, but also our insulin sensitivity and our inflammatory and immune responses. So actually what we see with the adipokinins is in the present, when we have an accumulation of visceral fat, which is the apple-shaped phenotype, this causes the adipocytes to dysfunction. With the dysfunction of with these adipocytes, there is altered regulation and interaction of the hormones that are secreted by the adipocytes. So if we take a closer look at that, this altered regulation and interaction, macrophages infiltrate those adipocytes. This then leads to an increased secretion of inflammatory cytokines. Those inflammatory cytokines are those then which increase the complications of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. As a result then, when you have these the macrophage infiltration and the inflammatory cytokine secretion, you can imagine then that there is a presence of low-grade inflammation in the individual. So as a result then, obesity is seen as pro-inflammatory. So what about appetite and satiety? We know that appetite and satiety are under neuroendocrine regulation. The neuroendocrine regulation controls our eating behavior, our energy metabolism, and also our body fat, our body fat mass. And this regulation occurs in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus. The arcuate nucleus has opposing neurons to balance the intake and the metabolism and responds to signaling molecules in the periphery. So as a result then, you have this idea that you have signaling molecules from the periphery that act centrally. It's also important to remember that neurons that promote substances to increase appetite are balanced by neurons that balance with those that suppress the appetite. So you have neurons promoting appetite as well as suppressing appetite. A closer look at that reveals that we have orexins and anorexins. Orexins are hypocretins that stimulate eating. Anorexins are incretins that inhibit eating. And these circulate according to an increase or a decrease in body fat mass. And as a result, then they signal the arcuate nucleus. So let's take a close look at orexins and anorexins. Orexins increase the appetite and decrease our metabolism. And the two that we'll talk about are ghrelin and the endocannabinoids. Ghrelin is one of the predominant orexins. Ghrelin is produced in the stomach. Ghrelin is produced in a response to hunger and actually activates ghrelin receptors in the hypothalamus. This stimulates the release of growth hormone, the release of gastric acid, gastric motility, and also pancreatic functions. So what happens then is the end result of this stimulation and the release of the acid, increased mobility, and our pancreatic functions, this leads to an increase in body weight, increase in fat mass, and leads to satiety. Because remember, what does an orexin do? It increases appetite, it decreases metabolism. So after we respond to the ghrelin and we satisfy our appetite, then there's a feedback loop that goes back to the stomach to turn off the ghrelin, and that's important. Remember, with all all hormone systems, you have a feedback loop to turn off the hormone. In addition, ghrelin also has cardioprotective and anti-proliferative effects. Ghrelin finally activates those specific neurons. And these are the same neurons that leptin and insulin inhibit. So ghrelin activates the neurons. Leptin and insulin inhibit those same neurons. Now, the second orexin we'll talk about are the endocannabinoids. These endocannabinoids increase appetite, the absorption of nutrients, and lipogenesis. As a result, there's an increase in adipose tissue accumulation both at central and peripheral receptor sites. So that's where you get in the peripheral and the brain effects. Now, if you remember a little bit about endocannabinoids, remember the cannabinoids are one of the active components of marijuana, which is a cannabinoid. We've used marijuana cannabinoids for years as an appetite stimulant for individuals with cancer, and we've also used it for HIV. Now, I know you would never do this, but maybe you have heard about individuals who smoke marijuana and they get the munchies as a side effect of smoking marijuana. Again, you would never do this, but maybe some of your friends have done this and you've heard of this. So what about the anorexins? Anorexins are the opposite of the orexins. So as a result, they decrease appetite and increase metabolism. The primary anorexin that we talk about is leptin. Leptin is produced by the adipocytes and again acts on the hypothalamus, that arcuate nucleus. When you don't have leptin present, that stimulates the appetite and decreases energy expenditure, because when you do have it present, you inhibit the appetite and increase that energy expenditure. So an anorexin decreases appetite or inhibits appetite and increases our energy expenditure, our metabolism. And remember, leptin has been identified in many circles as the obesity gene, as associated with the obesity gene. So what happens then is as you have more and more adipocytes, more fat cells, so as you have more of those, your secretion of leptin also increases. What happens though is that when you have very high levels of leptin, they begin to lose their effectiveness, because remember, the idea is to turn off your appetite. But when you have very high levels of leptin, they lose their effectiveness. And as a result, we are less sensitive to the leptin and we develop leptin resistance. So, and that's an important thing to think about with what happens, because you have all this leptin out there, but you're resistant to the leptin. So as a result, then the appetite doesn't decrease the way it's supposed to. So why do we become resistant to the leptin? Not completely sure. Is it not being transported? Is it not crossing that blood-brain barrier? Did the receptors become defective? I think we're going to have to stay tuned to learn more about that. But we know that when we become resistant to the leptin, we disrupt that signal of satiety. Therefore, we overeat and we increase our body fat mass. So what kinds of things will actually increase leptin? Stress, increased intake of simple carbohydrates, and insufficient sleep. And you've probably seen a lot more recently talking about how important it is to have 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night to protect ourselves from obesity. It's not quite that simple, but at least it does play a role. The second anorexin, again, that decreases appetite, increases metabolism, is glucagon-like peptide 1. This is actually produced by the intestines. And what GLP-1 does is stimulates pancreatic glucose-dependent insulin secretion and decreases gastric emptying. So what would happen? Increased satiety. The result then would be decrease the appetite and because of the influence of GLP-1 being produced by the intestines. And if you decrease the appetite, it functions as an anorexant. The last piece we want to talk about is adiponectin. Adiponectin is produced by visceral adipose tissue. And the function of adiponectin is physiologically to sensitize us to insulin. So it's an insulin sensitizer. So when the levels of adipose and visceral obesity, the levels of adiponectin actually decrease. Because of the decrease of the adiponectin in visceral obesity, we lose that insulin sensitivity. Therefore, you have more insulin resistance, leading to type 2 diabetes, and you also increase the risk of coronary artery disease. So decreased levels of adiponectin are associated with increased glucogenesis in the liver, decreased skeletal muscle uptake of glucose, there's that increase in insulin sensitivity, as well as an increase in inflammatory markers. So as a result, then, you lose the anti-inflammatory and the anti-atherogenic effect that adiponectin is supposed to play. So what actually occurs in obesity? Can we pull this all together? So what happens in obesity is we know that ghrelin and leptin are complementary but antagonistic signals. They are supposed to control our appetite and our satiety. So what happens in obesity is ghrelin does not decrease after we've eaten. So we lose part of that feedback loop. At the same time, leptin and insulin levels are high, but we develop resistance. We lose sensitivity to the effect of those hormones. We also know that the levels of adiponectin are decreased, and GLP-1 may be also decreased, and the endocannabinoids may be increased. So play with this in your head a little bit. What have we done? We aren't decreasing ghrelin. We are maintaining high levels of leptin and insulin. We decrease our adiponectin, we decrease our GLP-1, and we increase our endocannabinoids. As a result, then, we have ongoing appetite, we don't reach satiety, and we continue to increase our body fat mass in the metabolic pathway. Let's take that insulin resistance to the next step. That insulin resistance that is so important to obesity leads to an increase in lipids and fat storage, leads to increase in inflammation. We know that the adipocanines are altered, and again, it's associated with leptin resistance and a decrease in the adiponectin. So now you have the hormonal picture of this metabolic disorder called obesity. The last thing we want to address and think about is body shape and our phenotype, because body shape matters. And it matters in terms of where the fat mass is. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about visceral versus peripheral obesity. With visceral obesity, we have a phenotype that is characterized by the central distribution of fat, or the apple shape. We have to remember that fat is metabolically active, and the fat in visceral obesity is metabolically active. It's associated with increased lipolysis or lipolysis, inflammation, and metabolic syndrome. There was a recent meta-analysis. There are two things that I wanted to talk about here as it relates to this visceral obesity, because we talked about that fat in the visceral obesity, that centrally distributed fat being very metabolically active. As a result, we see an increase in type 2 diabetes mellitus, coronary artery disease, and remember we talked previously about some specific cancers. And this is highly the increased risk in visceral obesity more so than peripheral obesity. So let's take a look again at those obesity-related cancers. In 2014, the last time these data were run and reported, 40% of the cancers in the U.S. were related to obesity. Now, while a lot of these were related to the GI tract, we also know that additional cancers that were highly related to obesity included multiple myeloma, postmenopausal breast cancers, pancreatic cancer, kidney cancer, ovarian and uterine cancer. So the list continues to grow. We're now at 14. The other thing that I thought you might find very interesting, and I think it really matters to us as nurses and as healthcare providers, is that there was a recent meta-analysis reported in Obesity Reviews in October 2017. And what the meta-analysis looked at was shift workers, and they especially looked at those individuals who worked permanent night shift as opposed to rotating shift. And what they identified is that individuals who worked a permanent night shift had an increased risk of being obese, and that increased risk was about a 23% increase of risk. In addition, individuals who worked a permanent night shift had a 35% greater risk to develop visceral obesity. Now, why is this so important? First off, the difference was this relationship did not hold in individuals who had rotating shifts. The other reason I wanted to mention this meta-analysis is that there were, I think, about 23 studies included in the meta-analysis. 50% of those studies were conducted on healthcare workers. That hits us at our home. So why are shift workers, especially those on permanent night shift, more likely to be obese and more likely to have visceral obesity? The suggestion is that this may be related to disruption of the circadian rhythm. We know the circadian rhythm is heavily dependent on melatonin. Melatonin synchronizes our circadian rhythm, but it also regulates the secretion of insulin, cortisol, and leptin. So there's a big potential link there that needs to be further identified. Visceral obesity is different from peripheral obesity. Peripheral obesity is not the central distribution of fat, it is the extraperitoneal distribution of fat. So this is the pear-shaped individual. Pear-shaped individuals, this extraperitoneal distribution of fat is much less metabolically active than the centrally distributed fat. It is associated with less lipolysis and less inflammation, in addition to the less incidence of metabolic syndrome. So body shape matters. And you're going to talk about this more in your therapeutic management courses. And this also plays out in children as well as in adults. So as we look at obesity, it's a multifactorial process that involves interactions among genes, environment, behavior, hormones. Obesity results in multiple metabolic alterations that leads to increased incidence of coronary artery disease, type 2 diabetes, which is characterized by insulin resistance, and a number of cancers. The influence of hormones and the regulation of metabolism are really helping us shed light on how to manage as well as treat obesity. It's not just about everything that you eat. We have to look at this as a metabolic syndrome that has more than just a simple answer. I appreciate your attention. Let me know if you have questions.